Welcome to my podcast, Breakdown with Berckenhoff. I'm your host, Wyatt Berckenhoff. As you can see, this is my first episode, so I thought I would give a quick introduction of what Breakdown with Berckenhoff is going to be about. So essentially, this podcast is about me trying to understand politics through talking out loud and chatting with my live streamers and other things relating to it. Because what I'm planning to do with my podcast right now is live stream these podcasts to my Twitch, YouTube, and DLive, as I'll discuss in a little bit, and then publish those podcasts up onto all of the platforms where you might listen to a podcast. So that's kind of what I'm planning to do. But the main reason of doing this is mainly just thinking out loud and talking about news more in a way of how I view news and how I think a lot of normal people view news instead of just mass media, because basically what I'm trying to do is give new perspectives so that you don't just keep hearing the same thing over and over and over. And I also plan to do more solo perspective videos where I really try to dive into an issue fully, such as gun rights and gun issues and the Second Amendment rights and all of those type of things relating to gun rights as a whole topic. And in case you want to watch these podcasts live, if you're catching it on any of the Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other place where you might get your podcast, my Twitch is Roundtable Talk, my DLive and YouTube are Roundtable Decision, and that's where all of these live streams are going to get published. But before we really dive into today's topics and events I want to cover, I first want to give a couple of shout outs. FreedomScoop.com is a network that I am a part of, and Freedom Scoop is essentially a lot of content creators such as myself, Ed, Stephen Ingaramus, Generational Gap, and R-Rated Conservative on DLive, where we talk and just share our thoughts on, again, news and other events relating to society, and try to share how we view things compared to, again, the mass media. Our purpose of Freedom Scoop, or at least the purpose I view Freedom Scoop for the most, is to give an alternative viewpoint as I was just describing. So if you like my content, or you might want to check anyone that's kind of like myself, or just want to check someone else out to add to your list, you can check out any one of theirs on freedomscoop.com. Now to the breakdown. So what are we going to cover in today's podcast? There is a lot of recent news events, but some of them are more relating to what has happened in Chaz or Chomp, statues being removed and their impact. Is it rewriting history? What exactly is the reason for removing statues? Talk about COVID and news relating to COVID. Trump's doubt over COVID and maybe reopening of schools. Biden being Biden. And athletes saying stuff and doing stuff to promote their activism based off of their platforms. So as I just mentioned, I'm going to be on SoundCloud and any other of the podcasting websites with the Breakdown with Berckenhoff. And the first episode will be up as soon as I finish with my live stream and other things relating to it. And it'll also be on Anchor and everything else. So I thought before we dive into the first article, we would have to talk about Chomp or Chaz and its impact it's had so far. So those that know Chomp or Chaz, I'm going to give a quick breakdown of what exactly had happened. So originally it was an autonomous zone of protesters, you could say, who wanted to create a separate society within Seattle or within the place and make themselves have their own government, even though they didn't really have a government, but basically make a separate place where they would be able to live and to be able to protest peacefully and say, hey, you do not need police to have a society. You do not need this to have a society. And originally the mayor left them alone and kind of let them do their autonomous zone and keep as much peace as possible for this place. So originally Mayor Durkin decided to remove the police from the precinct. And by doing this, again, she allowed the protesters to have their area of peace or their area of protesting and not have any police impact. and therefore a lot of Chaz citizens felt somewhat threatened due to the lack of police presence. And there were several other things about them making walls and paying and having people pay to get in. So the one of their meanings was saying you don't need borders, you don't need police, you don't need whatever else you might want to say that you normally think a government or police force has. Yet they were kind of doing the same thing. So that is what a lot of people sort of noticed with Chaz. And as I just said, Mayor Dorkin decided that they would remove the police from the precinct in effort to keep this protest as peaceful as possible. And it was peaceful-ish for a long sort of time compared to what a lot of people thought. But people knew that this was eventually going to disappear. And it did disappear due to a lot of shootings, and most notably the shooting of an 8-year-old. And after these shootings, the Mayor Dorkin decided that this was no longer going to happen. Therefore, she sent police into Chaz, and this is the most recent thing that has happened, and said you have to leave immediately or you will be arrested. And I'm going to read a couple articles relating to this incident and give my thoughts about it a little bit more. But I thought a quick history of what happened with Chaz was necessary in order to understand the full events. So according to King5.com, 25 arrested during overnight protests. Seattle police dismantle CHOP. Seattle. A total of 25 people were arrested overnight in the area of Broadway and East Pine as protests continued after police dismantled the Capitol Hill organized protest zone, CHOP. Police used blast balls and pepper spray while making arrests after people in the crowd began throwing bottles at officers, according to the department. Demonstrators continued to march and protest on Capitol Hill, downtown Seattle, and some marched to Mayor Jenny Durkin's house. The Seattle Police Department moved into CHOP around 5 a.m. Wednesday and returned to the East Precinct after abandoning the building nearly 3 weeks ago. Officers arrested at least 44 people on Wednesday for failure to disperse, obstruction, resisting arrest, and assault. However, Seattle Mayor Jenny Durkin said she recommended the city not file charges against misdemeanor arrest from Wednesday morning. Durkin issued a 48-hour executive order for protesters to evacuate the area due to ongoing violence and public safety issues in the area of the East Precinct and Cal Anderson Park. Mayor Durkin order declared the gathering as an unlawful assembly that required immediate action. These acts of violence hurt our whole community, and they are also in direct contrast to message ringing from the streets that Black Lives Matter, Durkin said during a briefing after the operation. 2 teenagers were killed and other police were injured in shootings, and one are near the CHOP since protests began on June 8th. The precinct was evacuated on June 11th. And that brings me to a quick point. A lot of these protesting and what I'm later going to talk about with athletes and with statues is being directly related to George Floyd's death and the Black Lives Matter movement having another thing to branch off of and use their movement for good, or at least use their movement for something. So a lot of people were creating this Chaz autonomous zone using the Black Lives Matter movement as its name or as its reason for doing so. And depending on what you believe with Chaz will determine what you kind of view it as. Either this is a real sad event or a real happy event for people who are on the political spectrum. And there's not too many people that are in between what has happened with Chaz. I do say that I think a lot of people were more shocked about what that Chaz, like this event, was able to happen due to all of what would need to have happened for it to have an impact as it did. But I'll continue reading. King 5's Michael Groves said a majority of the protesters had left the CHOP by 6:20 a.m. Around the same time, SPD tweeted that officers continue to give disrepel orders and are moving remaining groups north through Cal Anderson Park. The Seattle Police Department basically reclaimed the precinct in less than 30 minutes, 5 feet at a time, with the bicycle officers out in front. A reporter with Seattle's said Mario Salisbury. Salisbury has been live streaming from the Chomp throughout the protest in Capitol Hill. SPD said officers enforcing Mayor Durkin's order were wearing a higher level of protective gear because numerous people in the area were in possession of firearms, and that suspects in recent shootings may still be in the area. At 6:35 a.m., SPD said it was investigating several vehicles that were circling the area after officers moved in Chomp. Police said that the vehicles didn't appear to have visible license plates, and the people inside were seen with firearms/armor. Police said 29-year-old man that was arrested Wednesday had a large metal pipe and a kitchen knife that he was taken into custody. Police tweeted city workers also recovered impulsive spike strips from the area around Chomp. Durkin has received criticism for allowing Chomp to remain in place for more than 3 weeks, but the mayor defended the wait, saying that the operation that took place Wednesday morning would not have been possible with more protesters occupying the area. Last week, Chomp organizers asked demonstrators to leave the area due to safety concerns. Seattle Police Chief Carmen Best said during a press conference Wednesday morning that officers searched the East Precinct to make sure there weren't any obstacles or any other concerns in the building. Chief Best said officers cleared the building but haven't moved into the precinct yet. Chief Best said SPD would start operations as the precinct as soon as we reasonably can. This is not the end of our department's engagement with demonstrators, said Chief Best. We must continue our efforts to build trust and refine our roles as guardians of the city. And it goes on to talk a little bit more about the activists and situations within Chomp or Chaz. And all of these articles I'm talking about are going to be linked in my description on YouTube and also in the description to the podcast in case you want to read the articles I am reading as well. But I also have another article and thing I want to talk about relating to Chomp or Chaz from CNN and Eric Levinson and Hurriyeh Humian. And I apologize if I butcher any names. Police disappeared protesters in Seattle Capitol Hill Operation Protest. Hundreds of police officers walked through on cleaning up the area, and the damage there is absolutely devastating. The chief was just stunned by the amount of graffiti, garbage, and property destruction. Durkin issued an executive order Tuesday in response to reported life safety, public health, and property issues in and around the East Precinct and Cal Anderson Park area, which protesters have occupied for the past 3 weeks, and which have been marred by a series of shootings. So as I was just mentioning in an introduction to Chomp or Chaz, a lot of people when Chomp or Chaz were happening, especially more on the conservative type of side, were saying that a lot of property damage didn't seem to matter for the view and our perspective of Chomp or Chaz. So basically, a lot of conservatives were pointing out that the Chomp or Chaz people, or protesters, didn't seem to care about property and didn't seem to think that property was something of importance like other people would think of it as. So essentially, looting and graffitiing businesses is something that wasn't necessarily might have seen as a crime to the protesters. And it's hard to really say for certain if that was the case, but a lot of people have, and myself I kind of include in this category, more think of it as to at least have some sense of true, but maybe not fully true. And the reason I say that is I don't think that these protesters cared much about private property, so you could say that they don't care about the laws relating to private property, and you could even say that they might not believe private property to be a ownership of that you own your property, that it's more the government owns it or the whole state of Seattle or whatever else owns that property. You don't physically own it. So a lot of people were talking about property ownership relating to Chomp or Chaz, because a lot of people were talking about when an autonomous zone got created, that this graffiti and lavishing of businesses and shutting down really of businesses was something that was seen as kind of odd. And I remember some people and business owners within Chomper Chaz, and mainly the black owners, kind of got more news coverage because they were complaining that these protesters weren't really taking their cause into account and more just being greedy and wanting to do this autonomous zone for their own self-interest rather than taking into account other self-interest or even their state self-interest or even their city self-interest, as you get smaller and smaller and more defined on what these protesters' motives were. Because motives and intent are something that are very important for discovering how and why someone wants to do something. And a lot of people, a lot of people are thinking that motives and intent seem to not as matter as much as they used to. But I would take into account a criminal, because a criminal's intent to do something, such as like murder or manslaughter, their intent is the only thing what determines whether if it was a murder physically on their hands or if it was them hiring a hitman, but they were still involved. So in other words, their intent of what they wanted to do matters significantly to how they get charged into what comes of their life from what they did. And I wouldn't necessarily say that all of these protesters are criminals. I don't want to get that wrong. Many of the protesters, especially in the Black Lives Matter movement, although a lot of them get credit because a lot of protesters use the Black Lives Matter movement to their own interest. And that's something that is very hard to determine whether the stance is of their interest or of a whole's interest. So in other words, an individual in what they do claiming Black Lives Matter is a little bit different than what the movement stands for. But at the same time, a lot of people might disagree fully with everything a movement might stand for. So it's very important to understand that the individual's motive is different. And that's kind of what I've been arguing with Chomper Chaz Zone and what happened with Chomper Chaz for the upcoming weeks until this article was written and until Mayor Durkin decided to kind of shut it down. And I think, as I said at the beginning, a lot of reason why I think it did get shut down was because Mayor Durkin didn't want any more violence and shootings on her name during a political election to interfere with their chance of Mike getting reelected or of the Seattle itself looking even worse than some people might view it. But I'll continue on and read from the article. Police tweeted anyone who remains in the area or returns to it will be subject to arrest. Their 31 arrests were for failure to disperse, obstruction, assault, and unlawful weapon possession. As I've said, and I will say, I support peaceful demonstrations. Black Lives Matter, and I too want to help propel this movement towards meaningful change in our community, but enough is enough, she said. And that's kind of a point that I don't know if I hit on fully, so I'll mention it again just to make sure. But a lot of reason why protesters are so big, and George Floyd's using his name, a lot of protests were peaceful during the day but turned violent during the night. And you could tell that there were different crowds within the day protesters and the night protesters. The day protesters seemed to have a motive or an agenda that they wanted to get past. And I'm not necessarily using an agenda in a bad way for this example. You could tell through that example in local area in Houston, or you can tell in other areas in like DC, where people went on their knees and prayed the amount of 9 minutes, I believe it was, that George Floyd had officer's knee on his head or knee on his neck and died from it. So that was a peaceful demonstration of George Floyd and what they wanted to change through police brutality and, as some say, systemic racism. And it's important to understand that protest from a protest that happened at night through all the looting and vandalism and just outright crimes such as burning cars and others that were being committed. And they still use George Floyd's name, and some people still use Black Lives Matter as their movement. But again, as I've argued, I don't think that the individual's interest using a movement is necessarily the movement's agenda or the movement's cause as a whole agency. And I think that's very important to understand, and that's kind of what I think that quote was also hinting at. But I'll continue reading. Thousands of protesters have occupied the 4 to 6 block area known as Chaz since early June in an effort to defund police reform following the police killing of George Floyd. But there have been 5 shootings in the area in the past 2 weeks, including 2 fatal ones. It is over because of the violence, Seattle community leader Andre Taylor told CNN last week. I have told people here, don't be focused on the location of Chomp. It is not a location, it is an idea. Dustin Ackers, who lives in an apartment complex in the heart of Chomp area, took several videos of police clearing a zone around 5 a.m. Leaving in the area has been incredibly unstable and violent around the clock for the past 2 weeks, Ackers told CNN. It started out well-intentioned and then quickly took a turn for the worse. The occupied area is now empty with tents and supplies thrown everywhere. He also shared an expert that his apartment complex, Packard Building Apartments, owned by Equality Residential, shared with residents on June 30th. Since the occupation of the street surrounding our buildings, tenants have been subjected to violence, threats, vandalism, noise, lewd content, public defection, daily fights, and limited access to building, the complex wrote. Residents were coming out of their homes and apartments and thanking the officers for being there to help them clean out the area, Best said. So we don't even know how much trauma people were experiencing because of what was happening in the area. U.S. Attorney General Bill Barr said that the Chomp area had become a haven for violent crime and praised the work of the police chief. As Chief Best made clear throughout the process, there is a fundamental distinction between discussion of substantive ideas, including addressing a distrust of law enforcement by many in the African American community, and violent defiance of the law, he said in a statement. And that's also something that I've heard a lot of people talking about more on YouTube side with Actual Justice Warrior and other YouTubers like himself, somebody I listen to, I would say, on a regular basis. And he talks about how a lot of people are born believing a certain event. So such as black people are born more afraid of law enforcement through what their parents teach them and other things, just to be a little more skeptical of law enforcement, while white people be more not as fearful of law enforcement through just how they're raised. And it is something that is a rather interesting opinion, but I'm not completely certain if it's 100% true. But I don't know if it necessarily makes too much of a difference, because in general, law enforcement after the death of George Floyd has been viewed in a more negative way than it has in the past. And it is something that was a evidence of outright murder of George Floyd. I don't think there's any question to it. And this movement of Chaz did get police brutality as its main effort, as the article said. The reason for making it was, again, showing that they didn't necessarily need police to have a society. And that's something that did work for a little bit until it turned violent, as you can see from Attorney Barr through his quote. It became a haven for violent crime. But that was also another thing that when I was kind of following along with Chaz and thinking about how something like that might have happened and gotten created, I was thinking about one point that kind of stood out to me, and that was the point of local residents and local business owners and how they might get affected. Because the movement of creating this autonomous zone and this separate society was something to show and to have an active demonstration of how a separate event could happen and a separate society could happen without law enforcement, as I've said already. But at the same time, they still had their perspective of borders and laws and other things relating to it, even if they were unspoken But long story short, my main perspective and thought was about how the business owners and residents might be affected. And there was some coverage over the business owners and residents and how they felt. And a lot of people simply just moved out of the area and lived elsewhere during the months where these protesters were living in the zone. But a lot of people, especially with COVID being so rapid the way it is, don't have the opportunity or money to simply just move out of the area. And I don't think that it necessarily was covered as much as it could have been due to the events and how the zone was created. And as I've said earlier, it depends on how you kind of align on the political spectrum to how you view Chomper Chaz being dismantled. But a lot of people are saying that through this demonstration that we physically saw and didn't just read about, it's not going to work because it just simply can't happen. You still need food, you still need borders to obtain the people, you still need a effence of guns and other things to make sure people stay within their line. But at the same time, if you don't have a law for society, it might turn violent, as the situation in Chomper Chaz did. So it's a very complex issue, and we're seeing the end to it, and a lot of people, including myself, kind of saw that this wouldn't necessarily last for as long as Chomper Chaz might have wanted it to last. But I do think it surprised a lot of people, even though I keep saying that, due to how long it lasted for. I think the majority of people didn't see Chomper Chaz lasting for as long as it did. And the people that did see it lasting as long might have saw a different impact happening from it. I do think that Mayor Durkin did allow for Chomper Chaz to extend its time period due to having the police move out of the precinct. But at the same time, due to how paranoid or paranoid might not be the right word, but due to how the protesters of the zone and people that wanted to live within Chomper Chaz and have it as their separate society were definitely very much against police and everything relating to police and their environment. So through to police being there and the chop zone existing, Mayor Durkin might have made the right decision due to having the police move out, just to make sure that violence against police wouldn't be at an all-time high in Seattle. But at the same time, it's hard to say because it's an alternative viewpoint that we didn't necessarily get to see fully live out. So it's hard to say if Mayor Durkin made the right decision, but due to the evidence we have so far, I would say that allowing the police to move out what made the Chomper Chaz last for longer and have some violence towards the end. Would this violence have existed if the police were still there? Again, hard to tell. But Chomper Chaz is now no longer existing, so we won't ever be able to have that alternative viewpoint. But I'm going to take a quick drink. And I see Ron here in the chat with his stickers. And hello, Ron. I hope you're having a good day as well. And just as I'm taking this break, I'll mention that thank you, Ed, for following me on my D Live. I highly appreciate that. And I hope to increase the D Live audience a little bit more. Because although I'm very, very small YouTuber, and I don't think that I'm ever going to really get to the point of getting removed from YouTube, because YouTube might not even exist by that point. Anyway, long story short, I don't think I might ever become a Stefan Molyneux and get removed the way he did. But due to how Stefan Molyneux was and he got removed, it is somewhat scary to how YouTube is censoring their information. But that's a whole separate video on a whole separate topic. But that's kind of why I decided to make a D Live. And I made a Twitch as well. And Twitch kind of has its own problems. But I still made a Twitch just to have another avenue for more people. And hello, Edgar as well. And he says the Ron Helton sticker party. He's known for that. You have to congratulate him on that one. Alrighty, and the funny thing with Ed as well with this is I'm using a lot of the articles you use on your stream as well, because I was looking at information and getting some new articles, and I do have some new ones in here as well. But I just all the topics I wanted to cover, your articles were already there, so I just decided, you know what, I'll go with these. So you could call it laziness, you could call it whatever you want, but I'm using a lot of the articles you have used as well, so I thought that was kind of interesting. So now we're kind of bringing on to a separate topic here with Christopher Columbus and statue removing as a whole. So the statue removing, I would say, is a complex issue, yet at the same time, you might not necessarily call it super complex. And what I mean by that is you have your two sides of people. You have your people that view these statues as representing fully bad and things that shouldn't be there because they're representing a person of history that shouldn't be represented in the way of a statue, because a statue is very much showing of that person in a great light. If a statue is made out of you, you know you're doing something. You've done something. But then on the other side, you have the people that don't want to see any of these statues removed because they're history, and we should be honoring our history through these statues, even if it's bad. Because you can learn history through its bad motives and through the events that happened, and try to say, hey, this is why it happened and this is why we shouldn't do it again. And history should be taught in both perspectives, showing good and showing bad. But a lot of times history simply just wants to show the good. And history oftentimes, as his famous saying goes, is written by the winners. So through the history being written by the winners and the people who want to show history and its perspective in the way they want them to, it's important to understand the fact that it may not be as simple as just rewriting history, but at the same time, it could be as simple as rewriting history. And I would say if you want to go a really generic route and kind of do a dot experiment. So if we do a dot experiment and say statues such as Robert E. Lee are bad and should be removed, where should they be sent to? I would argue, as I've kind of said in a separate video on my YouTube channel, a solo video, that if you do want to remove these statues, I believe they should be removed locally and then decided upon through local government. So if the local government and people decide that they want to see, in this case, the Christopher Columbus statue removed, then they should be voted on to see where this statue should go, and other people should have access to the statue if the city no longer wants it. So in other words, I believe local government should have the perspective of what happens with their statue, if they see it as bad or if they see it as it should stay and be there. And it's very important that this happens. But I would also argue that statues should be, not necessarily if you want them to be removed, put into a museum so that the museum can share the aspects of what was good from this person and why a statue was made out of them, but also what was bad and what shouldn't be repeated in history if you view a statue like Robert E. Lee as bad. Because I do think a lot of people view statues as simply a statue and don't necessarily think too much into it, because a statue is just a statue, I think, is the simple phrase you could use for that. But the thing that has become really confusing to me within the statue issue is the statues of people who were basically good in history, and you could argue the word of good, but I would say the founding fathers in history. Lately, there's been a big push to remove the Thomas Jefferson monument, the George Washington monument, and in the case of Abraham Lincoln, actually getting a statue removed of him with a slave, showing the freedom of a slave in Boston, and other talks of statues like it getting removed elsewhere, or talk of getting removed elsewhere. The one in Boston did happen, but there are several incidents of this Abraham Lincoln freeing the slave statue getting talked about being removed. And one of the big things about Abraham Lincoln was the fact that he was very much wanting to free slaves, or to pass civil rights movements within allowing for better access and better freedoms to blacks and other things relating to it. So in general, Abraham Lincoln, although he did have his bad parts in history, wasn't was a good guy for doing that, and a lot of people view Abraham Lincoln as somebody that should be remembered for that as a movement. But physically removing his statue, although he was very, very, very important to the access of new laws and new guidelines and new just life for blacks in general at that time, is very odd to me. But that's a whole nother separate incident you could have with statues such as them. But I guess my most general stance of this whole statue issue is that if you think that bad statues such as Robert E. Lee should be removed, it should, one, be done locally, two, if they have to be removed just as a whole, and forget local governments and forget everything else, it should be put in a museum so that they can be remembered for why a statue was made out of them. But the good statues like Thomas Jefferson, Robert E. Lee, and George Washington, I think should necessarily stay, because I don't think that they should be viewed in the bad light that some people are doing. And I think a lot of why they are getting removed is simply because of education and lacking of education due to how these people were and who these people are. And I think that's very important that we remember these people, even if you have to remember some of their bad. And I see Ron Helton here, as he says, it is right. It just takes a while to build a channel. Just keeping on. You will get there. Persistence and patience. Yeah, that's a big thing, and that's kind of why I want... The thing I'm kind of starting to do now with my channel is I want to keep very consistent. Now, I'm going to a backpacking trip in about a week, but I already have several solo videos that I'm going to be publishing on my YouTube channel so that there's still some content, even though there won't be any live streams for about like a week and a half. But I do think it's very important to keep it going and to keep content. So that's the main thing I'm focusing on now. But at the same time, I don't want to rush content and have bad content out on my YouTube channel, because I do think if you keep a consistent schedule and keep the content good, that's how you get views and that's how you keep your audience happy. And Ron continues to say, Lee was a great general. Succession is a right, not a crime. Lincoln was a tyrant and did not have the constitutional authority to force the South to stay in the Union or to make war with them. Lee gave the Union a run for the money until I had a brain fart at he had a brain fart at Gettysburg and decided to have a formal frontal war. Guerrilla warfare is the only same option. And then Ed says, Pretty Girls help too. Pretty Girls sell website clicks. Yeah, that's why you have a thumbnail, and channels. That's why thumbnails kind of crack me up about that as the whole issue. But also in general, if you're pretty beautiful, have the average looks, and you're a chick, you're generally gonna do decently well with your content. But obviously I'm not that, and obviously it's not that easy either, but that's a whole side note. So that kind of brings me back to this topic, and again, I appreciate your comments. But that it was funny. I did make a now that I'm thinking about it, I'll mention this and I'll go back. I did make a video about dancing, as Ron says. Yes, give us some dancing. Dancing. That was one thing. At one point, I was doing a series on Twitch where I talked about certain Twitch events that are rather odd, more in their just chatting section of the website. And a lot of it was dancing, or pool parties, or body painting, just odd things that seem to be only there due to sex appeal and wanting guys mainly to click on their content, give them clicks, give them likes, give them money. And it seemed to be working for a lot of people. And I made a video about it, just kind of talking about how bizarre it was. And it's not my best video, but it's still a video I think that was kind of a one-time thing I did, and I did enjoy it at the time, was about Twitch and dancing. And it was very funny to me, but it's one of my most disliked videos on my YouTube channel. So you can kind of see that a lot of people like that type of content if you're a bigger YouTuber, but at the same time, a lot of people don't like that type of content. So that's rather funny to me as the as a whole. But I'll go back onto my topic here, and that was of Christopher Columbus. So Christopher Columbus is a real interesting man in history. A lot of people say that his viewpoints were bad, and he brought the plague, and he did a lot of bad things, including slavery. But I don't think it's necessarily as simple that Christopher Columbus was just outright bad. And his nickname and his holiday at this point has been slandered and isn't even called Christopher Columbus Day in a lot of places, or at least schools are trying to call it something different. But the physical removal of his statue, I think, fits the same theme of what I was talking about before. And I don't necessarily think that these statues should be removed, but the city hall wanted it to be removed. Therefore, it did get removed because the people wanted it to be removed. And as the article says, for many people in our community, the statue represents patriarchy, oppression, and devilishness, Gathard said. That does not represent our great city, and we will no longer live in the ugly shadow of our past. So that type of quote seems to go along the lines of that some people speculate that the removal of these statues is rewriting history. So instead of embracing the events that happened, good and bad, they want to simply remove it and rewrite it to say, or to view themselves as overcoming, when in reality they're not really doing so. So before I get into my next topic, I thought I would introduce it just a little bit. And a lot of celebrities have always been vocal, and some celebrities more than others have been vocal within certain movements. You have people with the justice reform having podcasts, such as, I believe his name is, I'm not remembering his name now, but he owns a very popular podcast, or does a very popular podcast about justice reform, where he simply has made a whole advocacy based off of it, and he's a filmmaker as well. And the name's not sticking to me right now, but you also have just simply other activists, and you had the whole Gal Gadot and all other celebrities on YouTube about a month and a half ago, and that made its rounds, and it was with the singing of the song. But long story short, celebrities have been very vocal, and a lot of the celebrities use their vocal platforms for advocacy, and some celebrities are more vocal than others, and a lot of people tend to read what celebrities tweet and think about what celebrities talk about, because they view celebrities as somebody that might know a lot of information due to their status, but at the same time, they're not necessarily super smart over certain issues, or at least some of them aren't. But you kind of get it. They're celebrities. They're not necessarily experts of that field. And one of these celebrities is Alyssa Milano, as she pushes back lives. And this is mainly in reference to Black Lives Matter, as the headline says. Alyssa Milano pushes back Black Lives Matter effort to defund LAPD by 90%. Actress and far-left activist Alyssa Milano is attacking a union that represents rank and file members of the Los Angeles Police Department. The Hollywood star is also promoting an effort from Black Lives Matter activists called the People's Budget LA, which would defund the LAPD by 90%. What is Los Angeles Police Protective Lead at LAPPL is a narrow special interest group that lobbies our politicians to protect the LAPD budget, pension, plus officers, but allocates need to protect people, not police. Sign the People's Budget LA petition. The LAPPL has been fighting with Mayor Eric Gerviskia, I'm not sure how you say his name, over his anti-police rhetoric, and plans to defund the department in the wake of Black Lives Matter protests and riots. Eric called LAPD officers killers at a recent meeting with local black leaders. The mayor has made good on his threat to defund the LAPD, with the city council voting last week to slash the department's budget by $150 million. But the amount isn't nearly enough for BLM activists, who are pushing for even more drastic cuts. Leaders of the Black Lives Matter LA have launched an alternative fiscal plan called the People's Budget LA that calls for a vast majority of LAPD funding to redirect it to the community safety efforts and other alternatives. The People's Budget LA calls for the PLPD's budget to be reduced to a mere 1.64% of the city's general spending, down from 16.2% during the 2019-20 fiscal year. That would represent a 90% reduction in the LAPD funding. As this tweet says by Black Lives Matter LA, the Los Angeles Police Protective League is not a union, it's a gang. It buys off politicians, intimidates critics, and covers up the crimes of its members. This band of bullies won't silence us. We will expose them and stand in our power. Alyssa Milano is calling her 3.7 million Twitter followers to sign a petition in support of the People's Budget LA. She also encouraged her followers to take part in a social media pressure campaign on Monday against the LA Police Protective League. The LAPPL is a major obstacle to defunding the police and retaining public safety. Our goal is to highlight this, organizers of the Black Lives Matter LA said on the official site for the People's Budget LA. LAPD morale has plummeted in recent weeks following the Black Lives Matter protests and riots. The city has retroactively canceled the department's overtime pay while continuing to allow BLM protests to proceed despite the coronavirus pandemic. So the big thing I got from reading the article, besides just a celebrity being a celebrity, if you want to call it that, and using her platform for what she sees as good, but what some people might not see as good, is the fact of if you were to defund the LAPD as she wants to do, what is going to replace the police and give people to feel like they're still safe? So in other words, if you don't have police, what are you going to have to make sure that people still feel safe in what they are doing? Because it's very important that people feel safe and feel like they can trust law enforcement, even if they don't necessarily believe everything law enforcement might do. And as it also said at the very end of this article, it talked about morale being low. And I would say that every police department, at least of a major city, is feeling that the morale is being low. And low morale is not something that you necessarily want for police or any job in that matter, but definitely for police, because their number one job is protecting the community that they're serving. And you could argue that not every officer takes that goal as serious, but in general, you could tell that the average officer, as any other job, the average worker of that job, simply does what they're supposed to do. They might not have as much passion for it, but they're doing what their job and what their title is. So a lot of officers are trying their best to do it, but they feel like they're not getting supported, one, by the media especially, and two, by their department, and three, by the community that they represent. If your whole community is going against you, and you feel like, and it's your job to protect that community that's against you, your job has now become much harder and you're not getting paid as much. And that's a deadly combination to simply have officers just not feel as passionate about protecting the community. Some people might argue that officers have never felt that much passion about their community, but that's a very bold statement to say when, again, the average person of any job simply does their job, and especially a job that's public service, such as firemen and police officers. A lot of people join those jobs due to the pure passion they have to wanting to protect the community. And you could say, again, that's not that many officers, but it's still some officers. And if morale is low, you could potentially infect those officers that did have good motives and turn them into not so good motives due to simply not feeling respected by their community. So I would argue that that is a very, very deadly combination to what is potentially happening in our government or in our communities today. And I don't necessarily think that that combination of events is very good to continue on. And I'll take another break and check comments to make sure I didn't miss anything. And Ron says over on D Live that most celebrities are jackasses. And I would agree with that statement. I think most celebrities do have alternative motives. And Ed, referring to what we were speaking to earlier, says, Wyatt, learn how to do ASMR and get a wig. I will have to say, the first time I discovered ASMR was also on Twitch. And that stuff just creeps me out. I can't listen to it. That is just one of the weirdest things for me to try to understand. But I know a lot of people my age, or Twitchers in general that are more my age, all kind of want or listen to ASMR at some point. And I know a vast amount of people do enjoy ASMR, even if it is a more niche community. But again, that just kind of creeps me out. But I'm going to move on to my next topic of discussion, and that is simply coronavirus. So I don't want to spend too long on coronavirus because it is a topic that is surrounding everybody, and we live in coronavirus news central. In other words, everything we hear about is about coronavirus or has something to do with coronavirus. And the things we don't hear about coronavirus are directly relating to George Floyd in some sort of way. But I thought that this BBC article that Ed also had, and I believe showed on his channel as well, was a very good breakdown of what has happened with coronavirus. And I'll read. More than 3 million people in the U.S. have now tested positive for COVID-19, according to Johns Hopkins University. Over 131,000 deaths have been reported, and on Tuesday, the U.S. broke its record for the most new cases reported in a day. Despite the rise, the White House wants to press forward on some reopenings, including for schools. U.S. Vice President Mike Pence, who leads the White House Coronavirus Task Force, argued rules should not be too tough. Cases were flattening out, he said. What President Donald Trump said on Tuesday that America was in a good place regarding the pandemic. Over 60,000 new cases were reported Tuesday, shattering the previous highest tally of 55,220 new cases on July 2nd. The latest figures came as the states of California and Texas each reported more than 10,000 new daily cases. Dr. Anthony Fauci, Dr. Anthony Sucks, is an infectious disease expert and advisor to the White House on the coronavirus. Said that the country was still knee-deep in only its first coronavirus wave. White House pushes for schools to reopen. Speaking to reporters at the U.S. Department of Education on Wednesday, Mr. Pence defended the Trump administration response to the pandemic. While we mourn for those who mourn, because of what American people have done, because of the extraordinary work of our healthcare workers around the country, we are encouraged that the average fatality rate continues to be low and steady, he said after lowering his mask. He added that the U.S. Center for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, will issue a new guidance on reopening schools after Mr. Trump criticized a plan out forward by the expert body as very tough and expensive and threatened to cut off funding to schools that don't open in the autumn. The president said today, "We just don't want guidance to be too tough," Mr. Pence said. That's the reason why next week CDC is going to be issuing a new set of tools, 5 different documents that will be given even more clarity on the guidance going forward. Schools in the U.S. normally begin for the year in either August or early September. The CDC's guidelines suggest pupils and staff all wear face coverings and stay home if necessary. They also suggest schools should implement staggered timelines and social distance seating arrangements in close communal spaces. And I'll just read Ron here because I think it was kind of funny when I saw it. He just says coronavirus hell, and then he says bunch of mini tyrants running around the world mandating nonsense. If masks work, wear one. Leave others alone. Yeah, that's a big thing with masks, especially towards the beginning of this whole coronavirus thing. The World Health Organization, I believe it was, and the CDC, or one of the two, or both, were saying that they shouldn't wear masks. And I know Anthony Fauci at one point, or not Anthony Fauci, but the attorney surgeon anyway, the whole thing was that you shouldn't wear a mask at the start. Then they went back and said you should, and now they're saying that everyone needs to wear a mask. So the whole concept of if a mask should be worn is something that has changed, and it seems like a lot of people still don't know exactly what they're talking about when it comes to it. And you could argue that events change, but mask data has always been out there. So if they wanted to issue that you have to wear a mask, or mask should be recommended from the start of this coronavirus, it should have been issued from the start, because the data that was needed to tell if masks were useful were already there. So it's a rather bizarre thing. And I kind of wanted to also stop here to talk about my experience, as I am going to be going to a Maine 4-year university in August, and this 4-year university is saying, right now at least, that school is still planning to start on its suggested time, but you have to wear a face mask if you are to attend classes in person, and they're offering online courses to that same class environment. So in other words, if you want to stay home and do your college online, they're offering all online courses to every class, when some classes didn't necessarily have a online option. But at the same time, if you do want to attend college physically, you would have to wear a mask in class, and obviously probably outside of the classroom as well, I would think. And that's a weird thing, but I'll continue on here, as it says, cases still high in many U.S. states. And in case you're listening to this and not looking visually, it says, and this is in average daily cases in the last week per 1 million people. Texas is 261, Arizona is 508, Nevada is 247, Mississippi 238, Louisiana 312, Tennessee 209, Alabama 226, Georgia 258, Florida 408, and South Carolina 304. And then it has some of the others in lighter tint colors, such as Oklahoma and California, with a little bit darker of a color, but not as dark as Texas and others. So that is something that is rather interesting due to the spike. And one of the topics of conversation is the spike in cases relating to Trump's rally, or to protest, or are they to protest in general? Hence the title of my podcast in the first episode, Trump Rally Causes More COVID Cases, or Does It? So a lot of articles I've been reading, including this BBC one here, as you can probably tell if you're listening or watching visually, is it says spike in Tulsa after Trump rally. So there was a spike in Oklahoma after the Trump rally, and one of the health officials said from Tulsa that this was related to what he thinks to be the Trump rally, as many people were not wearing masks, as you'll see in a later article on today's podcast and live stream. But I wanted to first read Ron's comment, because it was something I was going to mention, and I think it leads great into this next topic of the spike. And he says, face masks for elementary is going to be a nightmare. And yeah, I was talking to a kindergarten teacher when I was cashiering their groceries, and essentially she was saying that right now Texas is wanting to issue face masks for students. And Texas hasn't gone and say what grade levels yet. But right now, it's to be assumed that all grade levels are going to have to be required to wear a face mask. But acquiring face mask for kindergarten or for elementary or for any lower grade is potentially very counterintuitive, because these lower grades tend to not have as high of cleanliness, especially if you want to use the stereotype of boys being messy. And all these germs are going to get spread around very rapidly due to these masks. So simply, these masks are not causing a greater impact in lower grades than what they might in higher grades due to more higher intelligence. But a lot of people in general don't like masks and don't like to wear masks. Many customers through my work have said that they tend to be touching their mask or touching their face around their mask, or simply just touching their face due to the mask, because they're not used to it and they keep just kind of touching around. And that's something that obviously you want to avoid within all this COVID and all these news and things being rapidly. being rapid, and that's something that needs to be watched for. So you could argue that masks simply don't have as much as an impact as others. But at the same time, a lot of health experts say masks are more to protect others from you than you yourself. And that's something that is kind of valued. But I don't think that necessarily having masks in lower grade levels is smart. And Ron says, there is no major spike in deaths, and the deaths that are occurring are from medical malpractice and people who have a weak immune systems. Fauci, Bricks, and other clowns are clueless. And that's another thing, especially with Matt Christian. So I think he's done a great job in his coronavirus coverage with his Sunday show with Blonde, and he's done I think a good job at kind of staying fair of coronavirus, but at the same time he's been a little skeptical from, I would say, the start of the whole coronavirus news and how he started covering it. A lot of events have come from cases and simply hospitals wanting to boost up their numbers. So if you die from a COVID-related death, so essentially if you already have an underlying health condition, let's just say such as cancer, and you're about to die from this cancer, and that's something that's completely tragic but does happen, and then you get COVID, and COVID then either makes your death faster or causes you to die, your death is counted as a COVID death. And you could argue whether that is good or bad, but I don't necessarily think that that's the whole point. The fact that it's tallied is something that's rather suspicious. And also, Matt Christensen talked about on this show, and I've read a little articles on it as well, is that testing centers aren't necessarily always accurate. There's false positives, and there's simply just misinformation with testing. You had the one incident, although it's not been fully proven on Twitter yet, because it is Twitter. It could have been totally made up, but it doesn't seem like the possibility of it getting made up would be very good, or very good I don't know how you would word it, but essentially the Twitter guy said that his dad was in line for getting tested, but had to leave, and the testing center sent him saying that he tested positive when he physically never got tested. So if these testing centers are mishandling their information, or simply causing everyone to be positive or more people to be positive than there are, it's something that is very dangerous and very concerning. And I'll also read Lartaris Wing, and I apologize if I didn't read your name right, but he says, Dems spread COVID-19 with Lunar New Year parades, and righteous burn loot spreads COVID-19 with their Black Friday sale, but Dems shamelessly blame Trump in indicting salons. Exactly, says Ron. Exactly, Laura Swing. And by the way, hi, Lartaris Wing. I am butchering that. I apologize. But that's a big thing when I'm about to talk into. I think if you don't trust the mass media at all, I think this next example with the spike in Tulsa and little evidence suggesting, as the next article I'm about to read, through to just in general protests, then this will give you a reason to not trust the media. And when I say media, I'm talking about any mass media. And that's why I think it's very important that you read both CNN and Fox, or read both left and read both right. Because as my tagline to my podcast is, most often the middle is right. Most often the middle of what Fox and CNN are saying is right. So the spike in Tulsa might be true, but it's also because the protest. So the protest having no rise in cases, but Trump's rally having rise in cases obviously seems a little bit weird. And I'm going to kind of get into that as well. As it says, spike in Tulsa after Trump rally. In Oklahoma, health officials in the city of Tulsa said President Trump's campaign rally there last month and the protest that took place at the same time likely contributed to spike in the cases locally. In the past few days, we have seen 500 new cases, and we have several large events just over 2 weeks ago, so I guess we just connect the dots, so Tulsa City Council Health Department Director Dr. Bruce Start said. The Trump campaign has not yet commented, and the Trump campaign has commented now, and Ed talked about it on his show this morning, or I believe it was this morning, about basically the guidelines that Trump's rally had. They offered masks, although many people declined. They also had plenty of hand sanitizer available, and they also implemented safety precautions within how many guests were allowed at the rally. So they did a lot of things to make sure that this coronavirus wouldn't spread due to a public event that was larger than 10 people. But these riots, as I'm about to talk about, didn't have anything relating to it because of what? Did they have hand sanitizer? Did they have masks? Like, what's the difference here? It's almost very aggravating that somebody could simply say that the only thing that coronavirus cares about is what political party you're a part of. That doesn't make any sense. And I'll continue here. Meanwhile, 2 prestigious universities in the U.S. are taking legal action against the government over an immigration rule they say will force international students to leave the country. And that's not particularly related to what I want to talk about here. So I'll go on to my next article. And this article made me very, very aggravated when I saw it on Ed's channel, and when I also saw it on reading it myself. But as you can see from this video, if you're watching live and it's re-downloading, I guess now, here we go. You can see a lot of people are wearing masks on these protests. Not that that necessarily really helps. But at the same time, you see a lot of people in this video that are simply just not wearing masks. And in a second here, you're going to see a guy eating a hamburger. There he is right there without his mask. And then now they're showing an overview of all these protesters very, 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 very close together with, cars in between. Not that that really matters. Holding signs. And these people being that close together, mask or no mask, is obviously something where if you look and you don't take politics into account ever. So if you do take politics into account, let's just say as a thought experiment, you call this street protest or this idea of whatever this event was from a Trump rally, and Trump was at the end of the street ready to speak to everybody. Similar to like what the pro-life rallies are in Texas and near Austin, or in Austin actually, you would say, oh yeah, these people are definitely going to have a surge in COVID. Look how close they are to each other, regardless if they're wearing masks at all. And this is just one example of what is happening. But if you take politics not into account and say that this is just a Black Lives Matter protest of George Floyd's death, oh yeah, no. There's not going to be any protests. There's not going to be any COVID. And obviously that just sounds absurd. And COVID doesn't care, as I've said earlier, what political party you're a part of. So that's something that is very aggravating when I'm going to read this article and talk about some representatives and their thoughts from George Floyd's death and all these protesters and looting and just violence in general that is more directive of sharing your DNA with someone else. Like I've already said again, and I just want to repeat it just to make it absolutely 100% clear. A virus, a epidemic, doesn't care if you even want to call it epidemic. Doesn't care about what political party you're a part of. And I know I'm getting a little bit more one-sided in this viewpoint, but I don't even think there is another side to it because coronavirus doesn't care. And the fact that these protests, besides a Trump rally, isn't going to cause a surge doesn't make any sense. But I'll continue on. There is little evidence that the protests that erupted after George Floyd's death have caused a significant increase in the U.S. coronavirus infections, according to public health experts. If the protest had driven an explosion in cases, experts say, the jumps would have started to become apparent within 2 weeks, and perhaps as early as 5 days. But it didn't happen in many cities with the largest protests, including New York, Chicago, Minneapolis, and Washington, D.C. Excuse me. In what's considered the first systemic look at the question, a term economists determined that only one of 13 cities involved in the earliest wave of protests after Memorial Day had an increase that would fit the pattern. It was Phoenix, where experts say cases and hospitalizations surged after a decision by Governor Doug Ducey to end Arizona's stay-at-home order on May 15th and eased restrictions on businesses. Arizona residents who were chomped up for 6 weeks flooded the Arizona area bars districts, ignoring social distancing guidelines. In many cities, the protests actually seemed to lead to a net increase in social distancing as more people who did not protest decided to stay off streets, said that study lead author Dafel Dave of Bentley University. The large-scale protest can impact both the behavior and the protesters and the behavior of the non-protesters. The paper was released last week by the National Bureau of Economic Research and has not yet been published by a peer-reviewed journal. And you could have your debate on the peer review status of something. A lot of peer review has gone under scrutiny over if it's actually been reviewed for the right reasons. But the fact that it hasn't been peer reviewed and simply just given as a truth and declared by many mass media websites as fact doesn't really seem to add up. And I would argue that any sort of common sense looks at this issue, as I've said, and sees those protests and having a surge and thinks, COVID, and then a Trump rally then causes COVID. And I argue if you take Trump out of it and just say a rally and it causes a surge, a lot of people would be like, okay, that makes sense. People are closer together and not necessarily following as safety protocols as fully as they should. But at the same time, it's your freedom of speech or whatever else you might want to say. And then, so the fact that there's just no increase doesn't make any sense. And I'm going to move on to my next topic before I get too angry. But it just makes no sense to me, the fact that people are looking at this study and this peer-reviewed aspect and saying, or not peer-reviewed aspect, and saying that, oh yeah, just because it was a Trump rally, more people are getting infected. Politics doesn't matter. It's a disease. If you're being close together is simply one way of getting it. And these protests, regardless of what motives they're for, are one way of getting closer. Therefore, a surge might be suspected. And if a surge didn't happen, then the disease might not be as potent as we thought before. But you could argue that all day long. And before I move on to this next article kind of talking about it, I'll read some comments here. Lauteris said, who said no need for travel restrictions? All the human trafficking with EU borders February 9th, 2020 led to COVID-19 hotspots. World Health Organization, said healthy don't need mask. April 1st, appearing news, China to Europe to NYC. They stole, and then Ed says, they stole the hand sanitizer and used it as fuel to burn the tars. And then Lauteris says, ever heard of Tom Clancy, The Division game? The dollar flu virus spread during Black Friday. Dims riders burn loop Black Friday sale. They block transporters in streets. They destroy stores. Ron Helton says, yes, we are experiencing utter madness at the hands of maniacs. And then Jay Edgar says, I have it. The only Clancy game I've ever played is Pelotiga. And I probably butchered that too. I am the worst with names. And thank you, Ron, for all the sticker parties on D-Live. I really enjoy that. It adds very much to the content. Makes me laugh. But this COVID stuff, especially political COVID stuff, is something that gets on my nerves. And as I can see in the comment section, also gets on the nerves of those who are watching right now, and probably those that are going to watch in the future. Because as I've already said, I think this is now like the 5th time, coronavirus doesn't care about your politics. But as AP News says, health official, Trump rally likely source of virus surge. President Donald Trump's campaign rally in Tulsa in late June that drew thousands of participants and large protests likely contributed to a dramatic surge in new coronavirus cases in Tulsa City County Health Department. Dr. Bruce, as we already heard. Tulsa County reported 261 confirmed new cases on Monday, a one-day record high, and another 206 cases on Tuesday. By comparison, during the week before the June 20th Trump rally, there were 76 cases on Monday and 96 on Tuesday. Although the health department policy is not to publicly identify individual settings where people may have contracted the virus, Dart said those large gatherings more than likely contributed to the spike. In the past few days, we have seen almost 500 new cases, and we have had several large events just over 2 weeks ago. So I guess we can just connect the dots, Dart said. So those articles kind of say the same thing, but I'll continue on for a little bit more. Trump's Tulsa rally, his first since the coronavirus pandemic hit in the U.S., attracted thousands of people from around the country. About 6,200 people gathered inside a 19,000-seat BOK Center arena. And I hate to steal Ed's joke, but I was listening this morning and I thought it was rather funny that he mentioned this, and I didn't catch it when I was reading the article with him, but it was like in a 19,000 seat. So it's like, why even put that on your article when you just kind of want to rub in the fact that he can't fill stadiums? Look, Trump is falling. People don't like him as much. It's just kind of a rather funny side thing to put in. And you could argue, well, they just want to put the capacity, but I think that's rather absurd. So I hate to steal your joke from this morning, Ed, but I thought I would include it in mine as well, just because it was rather funny and I didn't catch it the first time. But I'll continue. Dart had urged the campaign to consider pushing back the date of the rally, fearing a political surge in the number of coronavirus cases. Trump campaign spokesperson Tim Breakdown said the campaign went to great lengths to ensure that those who attended the rally were protected. There were literally no health precautions to speak of. Thousands looted, rioted, and protested in the streets, and the media reported that it did not lead to a rise in coronavirus cases. McFaul said in his statement, meanwhile, the president rally was 18 days ago. All attendees had their temperature checked, everyone was provided a mask, and there was plenty of hand sanitizer available for all. It's obvious that the media's concern about large gatherings begins and ends with Trump rallies, he said. Although masks were provided to rally-goers, there was no requirement that participants to wear them, and most didn't. A reporter who attended the Trump rally is among those who have tested positive for COVID-19, along with 6 of Trump's campaign staffers and 2 members of the Secret Service who worked in advance of the rally. And you could read all the rest of the article in the description if you want as well, but I think we kind of covered between those 2 articles the main points with Trump rally and the potential surge. And you had from his spokesperson with Trump saying that basically in his own way that just because there's a spike doesn't necessarily mean that there wasn't a spike from the regular protesters under George Floyd names and Black Lives Matter movement, as I've kind of already said, but I feel like we're kind of beating the drum at this point. So I'll move on to my next article, but I'll quickly go over some comments as well before we continue. As Lorder has said, Taiwan, New Zealand, Japan all disavowed WHO, China by doing travel restrictions and wear masks early. They also today still allow dining salons. San Francisco Mayor London Braid is stupid by blame in dining. Mayors and supervisors don't pay taxes but enjoy taxpayer-funded health care with pensions. They let rioters burn loot but still going up cost of living to tax you so that they can do graffiti. Dabasio spread COVID-19 by Lunar New Year parades and rioters. Dems use thugs to break glass of businesses during irrigation. Release criminals under the excuse of COVID-19. Mandate nursing homes, no precaution. And then Ron says, Tulsa is a liberal disaster area. What did they expect? He might as well try to fill a stadium in Austin, Texas, another liberal disaster area. And that's another point that Ron was kind of mentioning. The fact that the capacity of the stadium was even mentioned, and as Ed stated in his video, is rather odd, and I don't necessarily see as a point to even be really discussed. And the fact that he was able to fill it that much is rather surprising. due to the area of which the rally was being placed in. And as he mentioned, in Texas with Austin is known for its liberal, although it's the capital of Texas, which is rather bizarre to most of how Texans, view government or whatever else. But anyway, you get the point. But Lorderus is on fire with his comments there. And I don't necessarily think that I disagree with really any of his points. I don't necessarily know if the Democrats are pushing for rioters, but at the same time, the media isn't necessarily saying that these riots are necessarily bad and more endorsing these protesters and saying that protesters should continue because the movement is more important. So I do think that I kind of agree with Lorderus more than I disagree. I don't really disagree with him much at all. So I do agree with your comments, and I'll continue to the next one. And ironically, this next article is about WHO, the World Health Organization, that you mentioned earlier in your comments. So this article was by The Hill, and the title reads, Trump administration moves to formally withdraw the U.S. from WHO. The White House has officially moved to withdraw the United States from the World Health Organization, a senior administration official confirmed Tuesday, breaking ties with a global public health body in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic. The U.S. has submitted its withdrawal notification to the United Nations Secretary General, the official said. Withdrawal requires a year's notice, so it will go into effect until July 6, 2021, raising the possibility the decision could be revised. Senator Bob Menendez, the top Democrat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, tweeted that the administration informed Congress of the withdrawal plans. To call Trump's response to COVID chaotic and incoherent doesn't do it justice. This won't protect America's lives or interests. It leaves America sick and alone, the senator tweeted. The formal notifications of withdrawal concludes months of threats from the Trump administration to pull the United States out of WHO, which is affiliated with the United Nations. President Trump has repeatedly assaulted the organization for alleged bias towards China and its slow response to the coronavirus outbreak in Wuhan. But public health experts and Democrats have raised alarms that his decision may be short-sighted and could undercut the global response to the pandemic, which has affected 11.6 million people worldwide. The U.S. has the highest number of reported cases in the world at nearly 3 million. So before I move on, I thought I would just quickly talk about the senator's tweet. And simply to put it as simple as leaving America alone with WHO is rather bizarre, and I don't necessarily think is a very educated opinion of the perspective. You could argue that Trump's response of COVID isn't necessarily as well, but it's hard to live in an alternative universe where anyone else has responded to it, and how might the former president of Obama have responded to a worldwide pandemic such as coronavirus. And I would like to see anybody's response of what they might think President Obama would have done, or an alternative universe with Hillary Clinton might have done in response to all this COVID stuff. But I just don't think that it's really as simple as the senator is making it look like. But I'll continue. They have also argued that some of WHO's initial missteps can be attributed to China's lack of transparency in the early stages of the outbreak. I disagree with the president's decision, Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Chair Lamar Alexander, Republican, Tennessee, said in a statement. Certainly, there needs to be a good look at the mistakes the World Health Organization might have made in connection with the coronavirus, but the time to do that is after the crisis has been dealt with, not in the middle of it. The president first froze funding for WHO in April, while his administration conducted a review of its relationship with the entity weeks later. He wrote to WHO demanding reforms, but did not specifically what those refunds would be. That seems like a mistype, but Trump announced at the end of May the U.S. was terminating ties with WHO. So that's kind of where I wanted to stop with this one, and I think it's very important to view the reaction of what WHO did with coronavirus. And I don't want to stick too long with COVID-19 because, again, it's inundated all around us, and most of the news is directly related to COVID. And I don't necessarily think that a lot of people are wanting to hear about COVID as it's inundated around their life. But who is the thing I most dislike about WHO is their constant changing of what they said to do. And a lot of people, and I've looked into it briefly, but I don't necessarily have a full opinion of, but essentially WHO didn't really view this as a threat as early as they could have. And you could argue that they don't have the vision of the future, so they can't necessarily predict something when it has yet to happen, obviously. But at the same time, a threat like a pandemic and something that could have been as huge as was projected to be should have been addressed a little bit more early on in the whole advisement of what their role is as an organization. So WHO is something that is, I don't know a lot about, but I definitely think that they were wanting to either kind of hide information from the public due to try to keep everyone calm, or more darker motives behind what happened. But I'll move on to this AP article as well by Colin Blinkley, and it's about Trump wanting to reopen schools. I talked about it on the previous article, and this one mentions a little bit of the same stuff, but also a little bit different. So I'll read some of what Trump directly said about wanting to reopen schools, with Pence being the director or the main member of the task force relating to it. So President Donald Trump on Tuesday launched an all-out effort pressing state and local officials to reopen schools this fall, arguing that some are keeping schools closed not because of the risk of the coronavirus pandemic, but for political reasons. They think it's going to be good for them politically, so they keep their schools closed, Trump said at the White House discussion on school plans for the fall. No way. We are very much going to put pressure on governors and everybody else to open the schools. The White House roundtable gathered health and education leaders from across the nation who said schools and colleges are ready to open this fall and can do safely. They argue that the risk of keeping students at home outweigh any risk tied to coronavirus, saying students need access to meal programs and mental and behavioral health services. We want to reopen the schools, Trump said. Everybody wants it. The moms want it, the dads want it, the kids want it. It's time to do it. But the bright outlook was met with skepticism by some beyond the White House. The president of the nation's largest education union said Trump is more interested in scoring points for the November election than keeping students safe. Trump has proven to be incapable of grasping that people are dying, that more than 130,000 Americans have already died, said Lily Gonzalez. I'm not even going to try. President of the National Education Association. Educators want nothing more to be back in the classroom and on college campuses with their students, but we must do it in a way that keeps students, educators, and communities safe. At the White House event, Trump repeated his claim that the Democrats want to keep schools closed for political reasons and not health reasons. He made the same claim on Twitter a day before, saying they think it will help them in November. Wrong. The people get it. Trump offered no evidence for the allegation, which has been criticized by health experts who say politicizing the issue will make it harder to work towards reopening schools. Jennifer Nuzzo of Johns Hopkins University COVID-19 Testing Insights Initiative said she was deeply troubled by the claim. So again, coronavirus is already as hard as it needs to be due to its simple impact it's had. Even if you don't think that it's really as big as the media is wanting it to appear, you could still see that coronavirus has had an impact on your life, even if you've lived under a rock. But at the same time, trying to make coronavirus political is something that is simply just wrong. And you could argue that Trump might have made coronavirus a little more political than it's had to, but anything Trump says gets criticized by the media. So Trump could 100% say that coronavirus is the biggest issue, and he would still get criticized by the media. So instead, Trump has stuck to what he's always stuck to, and that's what he wants to say, even if a lot of people don't think that what he wants to say should be said, because it's more of an internal dot, and a lot of people keep their internal dots to themselves for obvious reasons. But he's the president, and he's won, a lot of people say, on his bullish factor, and that he's not afraid to say what he thinks and say what's on his mind, even if that some people say that's his greatest downfall. And that's one of the big things with Trump. And Trump wanting to reopen schools makes a lot of sense, but at the same time, trying to make the decision purely political doesn't make sense. Coronavirus is important, but at the rate that people are dying from coronavirus, so I don't want to disvalue anybody who has died from coronavirus or seriously injured and might die from coronavirus. Coronavirus is a big issue and something that does need to be talked about and think about. But at the same time, Trump needs to be careful in his response to wanting to open schools. But at the same time, the only way to think about how schools might open is to talk about it. And simply talking about how schools might open isn't political and more starting a discussion. And that's kind of how I view this issue. So simply saying that his comments are hurtful is kind of wrong. And saying that Democrats want to keep their kids away from school might also be a little bit wrong. But you could argue that they're wanting to make the situation political in that perspective. But I'll continue on to my next topic here with maybe one of your favorite senators, Ilhan Omar. But I'll first take a drink break and check the comments. Alrighty. So this one is by the Daily Caller, as it says, Ilhan Omar calls for dismantling of the U.S. economy, political system. Democratic Minnesota Representative Ilhan Omar called for the dismantling of the U.S. economy and political system Tuesday. As long as our economy and political systems prioritize profit without considering who is profiting, who is being shut down, we will perpetuate this inequality, Omar said. We cannot stop at criminal justice system. We must begin at the work of dismantling the whole system of oppression, wherever we find it. Omar held an event Tuesday in her home state of Minnesota with members of the Minnesota People of Color and Indigenous Caucus. Omar tweeted earlier Tuesday that the purpose of this event was to address racism in policing in the aftermath of George Floyd's death. And this is a tweet from Representative Ilhan Omar. As she says, the murder of George Floyd reawakened calls to address racism in policy and reform our criminal justice system. I am live with leaders of the Minnesota People of Color and Indigenous Caucus to discuss our work to make systematic changes on Facebook now. Omar has joined calls from local Democratic leaders to defund the police after 4 Minnesota police officers were fired and charged in connection to Floyd's death. The Minneapolis City Council unanimously voted to get rid of the city police department in June. Omar said she supported the vote because she believes the Minneapolis Police Department is beyond reform. You cannot really reform a department that is rotten to the root, Omar said at the time. What you can do is rebuild, and so this is our opportunity, a city to come together and have the conversation of what public safety looks like, who endorses the most dangerous crimes who take place in our community. So again, as I mentioned a little bit with Alyssa Minato about wanting to reform the police system, you could simply just ask what might replace police. And I don't necessarily have an answer for that. And I wanted to include this article to give a perspective on what Ilhan Omar was doing. And I don't necessarily think that what Ilhan Omar is saying is 100% correct. And defunding the police can lead to several outcomes that I don't think are great for the community that the police try to protect. And I think that's kind of already been talked about, but I more wanted to read this article and share her thoughts, as I thought it was still pertinent to an earlier topic we talked about. But this next one is, again, back to Trump and the ongoing issue of his impact or his role in Russia. And Trump has obviously been a controversial figure within this Russia movement and has been attempted to get impeached. People have attempted to get him impeached over his impact with now really Ukraine and Russia. But I'll quickly read on this article. Representative Seth Moulton, a former Marine Corps officer, accused President Trump of treason on Wednesday over reports that Russia paid bounties to Afghan fighters to kill American soldiers, and the White House took no action in response. Moulton, a former platoon commander in Iraq, said if he led his Marines into an ambush because he failed to read an intelligence report, he would be in prison. The Massachusetts Democrat questioned why the commander-in-chief is not held to the same standard. It is not treason that I don't know what it is, Moulton said Wednesday on a House Democrat caucus call with reporters. If I led my Marines into an ambush because I didn't bother to read the intelligence report I was given, that said, we would get ambushed there. I would be tweeting that it wasn't my fault because I didn't read the report. I would be in prison, Moulton said. The comments from Moulton, who had a short-lived 2020 presidential run, came as the Democrats have ramped up the rhetoric against Trump over the Russian bounty reports and demanded more answers from the White House about the intelligence assessment, and first reported by the New York Times that a Russian military unit paid bounties to Taliban-linked fighters to kill coalition troops in Afghanistan. The White House has pushed back on reporting saying Trump was not aware of the bounty program and intelligence officials didn't tell him because there was no conscience within the intel community of the alleged plot. Trump dismantled the reporting as a hoax. The Russian bounty story is just another made-up fake news tell that is only to damage me and the Republican Party, Trump tweeted. The New York Times reported that the information about the bounty program was provided to Trump in his daily written brief in late February. This intelligence was taken seriously enough that it prompted an interagency meeting with the National Security Council in late March, and U.S. officials shared the information with the British government, whose forces were also believed to have been targeted by Russian bounties, the Times reported. It has been reported, however, that Trump does not read the detailed presidential brief regularly and is more often briefed on intelligence issues verbally. Trump's national security advisor, Robert O'Brien, told Fox and Friends Wednesday that the CIA officer who briefs the president decided not to tell the commander-in-chief that Russia was allegedly paying bounties to kill U.S. troops. The intelligence community does not have a conscience, and as a result, the president's career CIA briefer decided not to brief him because it was undervaluing intelligence, O'Brien said. And by the way, she is an outstanding officer, and knowing all the facts I know, I certainly support her decision. Trump 2020 Democrat challenger Joe Biden argued that the president failed in his duties, whether he knew or didn't know of the bounty intelligence. The idea that someone he didn't know is duration of duty, if that's the case, the former vice president said Tuesday in his first press conference in nearly 3 months. And if he was briefed and he didn't do anything about the deceleration of duty. Moulton's comments, however, have been further as he essentially accused Trump of being responsible for the deaths of U.S. service members in Afghanistan. The New York Times said investigators are reviewing at least 2 deadly attacks on American soldiers in Afghanistan for suspected links to the bounties. One is on April 2019 bombing outside of Bagman Air Base that killed 3 Marines. Staff Sergeant Christopher Slutman, 43, Corporal Robert A. Hendricks, 25, and Sergeant Benjamin S. Haynes, 31. The second attack was not identified. And I'll read Ron's comments here as he says, I seriously doubt that there is any bounty that is more electioneering before the November election. The media is crap in this country. The New York Times is the worst offender. They still keep saying that the Russian influenced the 2016 elections with partly few thousands of dollars. Show me that they physically changed votes or they should shut the hell up. I agree that a lot of mass media, and that's why Freedom Scoop is made, and I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast and the episode here, and that's why I try to give my perspective on issues, and others like Ed and Generational Gab and Already Conservative and them try to give their impact as well to all these issues. And mass media, especially now, tends to just want their agenda to get passed and all their motives relating to it. In this event, if true, is obviously very big against Trump. But at the same time, I don't think that Trump is the one to blame for this, as said by the CIA officer. And you could say that the CIA officer is backing up for Trump because he is the president. But at the same time, I think right now it's very popular to go against Trump. And so even if the person's job is to inform Trump, you would think that if they were to have a motive to go against them, they might, just because it's so popular and it will get so much attention. Essentially, they would be a martyr for their cause. That's something that I think a lot of people are attempting to do within the party. And you could say that this Moulton guy might be that person that's trying to get it to happen. But to physically or to verbally blame the president for something that you don't know is 100% true is rather interesting and a bizarre thing to have happen, even if you disagree with what the president has to say. But I didn't want to spend too much time on this, and we'll go on to this next one here. And this one is of the good old Biden. And we all know, Biden, and he has recently said that, Biden has come up and mentioned about that he doesn't support Trump's claims with the Supreme Court. And recently Trump was wanting to release his new names for potential Supreme Court representatives in case one of them were to retire or more likely probably pass away. And Biden wanted to respond to this issue. So I was going to play this video for you, and hopefully you'll be able to hear it well if everything is working right.
And on another issue that's been in the news last week, this week, probably next week, the Supreme Court. The president says he's going to issue an updated list of potential nominees to the court. You have said you would put a black woman on the court should a spot open up, but there are groups calling for you to release a list of specific names you put on the court. Are you going to do that?
One thing I hesitate to do is follow anything the president does at all, because he usually does it all wrong. We are putting together a list of a group of African American women who are qualified and have the experience to be in the court. I am not going to release that until we go further down the line of vetting them as well.
So that was Biden comments over potentially having a black woman of color, obviously black as the color, being a representative for the Supreme Court, or simply being a Supreme Court justice. And obviously that is a common theme within, you would say, the Democratic Party. They are essentially wanting a person of color, mainly a woman of color, preferably, to be a representative or to become the next president. The Democrats ran several people of color, according to Cory Booker, Kamala Harris, and you could even, Kamala Harris and Cory Booker being the main two, I would say. but none of them went super far within the presidential race, with ultimately Biden winning the Democratic race. The Democratic race, not the presidential race, but you get what I'm saying. And a lot of people are speculating that although this isn't related directly to the Supreme Court, that Biden might pick someone of color and probably a woman to be his vice president for this presidential race against Trump and most likely Mike Pence. And a lot of people are saying that Biden is going to do that simply based off of the fact that it's a person of color and something the Democratic Party wants to be stand for. Because in general, the Democratic Party wants to be seen as the party for minorities and has always said that they're the party for minorities. But a lot of people might see it as pandering if Biden were to do so, and if Biden were to release his list as of now with a black woman of color. But at the same time, it would make history. And all this article says is what was directly said in the video, so I'm not going to read the quotes again, but I thought I would just kind of quickly mention that as a whole debate over Biden, because there isn't really that much going on with Biden right now. Although he's come out a little bit more publicly, he's not really done so much so far, and in majority stayed quiet, although he's had a few things on his YouTube channel where if you ever want a few laughs, you should probably check out, because he's definitely a gaffe machine even on his own YouTube channel and his own live streams. But I thought I would read Ron's comments here. Hashtag bumbling Biden. Vote blue, no matter the shrew. Vote Biden. Let your mind take you away. Honestly, that would probably be a good Biden shirt. Vote. And then Ron says virtual signaling is all the Democrats are good at. And again, that is 100% true. Because a lot of times, as I kind of said, the Democratic Party is trying to show themselves as being the party for minorities. But I think it's become even more obvious that the Democratic Party's main motives are essentially wanting someone to be of color and pandering to minorities. And I think a lot of blacks, especially because they tend to target the black poor type of population, are starting to see through it. But you could argue that the Democrats might have been that way from the start. But anyway, and this was kind of my fun articles before I move on to the next topic that is a little more fun sort of stuff compared to all the coronavirus and purely political stuff. But you might have remembered that incident of the white woman versus the black guy and the dog walking incident. And anyway, I'll read the story to get your updates. As it says, Christian Cooper told the New York Times that he doesn't want Amy Cooper to be charged and that he won't cooperate with Manhattan DA. On the other hand, she's already paid a steep price, Cooper said. There's not enough of a different to others. Amy Cooper, the white woman who called the police after a black man asked her to keep her dog on a leash. By the way, this was nicknamed the Battle of the Two Karens, so I'll mention that real quickly. The New York Times reports that Cooper, who was filmed by Christian Cooper, so that's not going to in the ramble at Central Park, where it is against the rules to have dogs off a leash, will face misdemeanor charges. Christian Cooper was the area bird watcher, and when he approached her requesting she put her dog on a leash, she threatened to call the police. In the video, she told the police via phone that she was being threatened by an African American man. Today, our police the police initiated a prosecution of Amy Cooper for falsely reporting an incident in the third degree, said Manhattan District Attorney Curtis R. Vance. We are strongly committed to holding preparations of this conduct accountable. The incident inspired the New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, and he's a fashionable guy, Andrew Cuomo to authorize a bill that would make it a hate crime to call 911 and cite a false accusation due to race, our religion. Shortly after the video went viral, Amy Cooper was fired from her job and surrounded and surrendered ownership of her dog. At one point in the video, Christian Cooper accused her dog of tearing through the plantings. And when he approached her with the dog treat, she screamed at him and told him not to come closer to her dog. The clip was recorded on Memorial Day, the same week as George Floyd's death, at the hands of the police provoked protests across the community. So again, this was more the battle of the two Karens. You obviously had the woman who was walking her dog without a leash at the innocent, and then this black man, or African American man as she called him, comes closer to him saying, "Hey, you have your dog off the leash. You need to put him on a leash due to rules." And then when she said no, he then took out treats and said, here, come on, trying to get the dog to come to him or to come closer to him. And obviously the dog was like, no, obviously the dog was like, yeah, treats, I want the treats. And she was like, hey, stop, you don't want them you stop, you can't take a dog. So obviously he started peacefully, you could argue, but then he escalated the situation himself. But at the same time, she kind of filed an incident that really shouldn't have been filed in the first place. So this whole issue was just kind of funny, and I thought I would read it and kind of mention it as an update to what had previously happened, and you might remember, as it's kind of a funny situation. And Ron says, the Democrats are the ones, Biden's tough on crime bill, who passed all of the legislation that penalizes the black community more in the drug war. They hate minorities. Yeah, that's kind of the real big thing. And I want to make a video on justice reform as a whole topic in a podcast, as I'm doing now, but just on that topic, as I mentioned on the start of today's episode and podcast. About that, I want to do individualized topics where I go in depth and kind of talk about them out loud. And justice reform is one of those issues, because a lot of times Democrats try to pass legislation that allows for blacks to have more fair crimes or less crimes against drugs or other things. But at the same time, they were the ones that kind of put this legislation up in the first place, or largely put it up in the first place, according to history, and mainly, as Ron mentioned, with Joe Biden. And then Ron says, never approach or give treats to another person's dog without their permission. That is a huge no-no. See, that's the thing about this whole battle of the Karens also in this story is the guy wasn't necessarily in the right either, nor was she. So at the fact that the police report got filed against her and not necessarily the main guy doesn't really make too much sense either, because they're kind of both at fault, hence the situation and what happened. But the fact that he doesn't want to release charges against her kind of makes me think that he knows that as well, because he was also the Karen of this situation. So it's just kind of a rather funny incident. But I've never had dogs myself, but I know many neighbors who have had dogs, and other people I know through friends and stuff who have dogs, and that is a big no-no, as Ron was talking about. And I was going to quickly show this tweet as well, as it says, Don Lemon started talking over Terry Crews real quick once it became clear that Crews was going to mention BLM's real agenda. So obviously, you had the whole incident with Don Lemon. Oh, sorry. You had the whole incident of Terry Crews and Don Lemon. So Don Lemon is an anchor on CNN, and Terry Crews is not an anchor on CNN, but he is a black activist. But he, in large part, is somebody that tells a lot of what's on his mind and more the way he sees it. And he's not the typical black celebrity that views Black Lives Matter and everything they say to be 100% truthful, since the quote of what was mentioned above. So instead of me just blabbering on, I was going to play this Twitter post to you as well, and we'll go from there.
I became sick. Like if I told you to wear a mask,
Terry,
they want to kick you out.
You're a high-profile person. You're writing things out there. You know you're going to get backlash. You know people are going to respond to what you're saying on Twitter. So I don't think you should be surprised by that. I have a skin as tough as an armadillo because of what I do, and I think maybe you should adapt that. But here's what I have to say. The Black Lives Matter movement was started because it was talking about police brutality. If you want an all Black Lives Matter movement that talks about gun violence in communities, including, black communities, then start that movement with that name. But that's not what Black Lives Matter is about. It's not an all-encompassing. So if you're talking about, if someone started a movement that said, cancer matters, and then someone comes in and says, why aren't you talking about HIV? It's not the same thing. We're talking about cancer. So the Black Lives Matter movement is about police brutality and injustice in that manner, not about what's happening in black neighborhoods.
That's
There
true,
are
Ron.
people who are
That's
working
true.
on that issue, and if you want to start that issue, why don't you start it? Do you understand what I'm saying?
But when you look at the organization, police brutality is not the only thing they're talking about.
I know that, but I agree, but that's not what the Black Lives Matter movement is about, Terry. Black Lives Matter is about police brutality and about criminal justice. It's not about what happens in communities when it comes to crime, black on black crime. People who live near each other, black people, kill each other. Same as whites. 80-some% of white people are killed by white people.
True.
Because of proximity.
Very true.
It's the same thing with black people.
But
That happens in every single neighborhood. But that doesn't, again, I'm not saying that's not important that those kids died, but it's a different movement.
So that was the whole thing with Don Lemon. And obviously Ron Helton kind of says the same thing in the comments, and I'll get to that as well. But I thought I would quickly mention this comment on Twitter, as it's one of the top comments that is shown in this whole reply thread, you could call it, on Twitter. And he says, why even do an interview if you're not going to let the man talk? And that's in reference to Don Lemon, obviously. As Don Lemon is obviously somebody who likes to have different people on, mainly different people relating to what he already believes. But he's somebody who I've watched somewhat, and I used to watch a lot more, but he's kind of gotten more on my nerves lately, is he likes to just talk and say the points that he wants to talk about, regardless of what the other person is saying. And Ron says, Lemon is a terrible interviewer. He initially tried to drown out Terry. That's the thing, is as Terry was talking, he just kept talking over him just to say what he already believed. And obviously this is just kind of yucky and gross, and a clear demonstration of what Don Lemon views Black Lives Matter and what they try to show on a more political spectrum and what they show to everybody else, and you could say the general audience. While Terry Crews was more going to give his view, yet in this clip, and I played the whole thing so you could understand the whole thing and didn't think I was cutting anything out, was the fact that Don Lemon didn't let Terry speak at all about what he viewed the Black Lives Matter in being. And I just thought that was kind of a clear demonstration of, again, mass media wanting to control the narrative fully in what they want to see and what they want to hear, and not let anyone else's opinions, even if they are a main celebrity and somebody with a differing opinion. My next topic is more on sports and celebrities, as I mentioned in my introduction to the podcast. And a lot of celebrities use their platform, but a lot of people in sports also use their platform for activism and other things relating to it. And you obviously probably can think of one person's name before I even say it out loud and get to the article about him, of somebody, especially in sports, that has made activism one of his big issues. And I don't even probably have to say the sport he is in to name that person in your head right away. But I thought I would first mention this article by Pro Football Talk and NBC Sports, as it says, report, NFL to play Black National Anthem before season opens. The NFL will play Lift Every Voice and Sing, commonly known as the Black National Anthem, before every season opener, Jason Reed on ESPN reports. Stadiums will have someone perform Lift Every Voice and Sing before the Star-Spangled Banner, according to Reed. Some players, as well as Texans coach Bill O'Brien, have already committed to kneeling for the national anthem. The NFL is considering other measures to recognize victims of police brutality during the upcoming season, per Reed. The proposals including listing the names of victims on uniforms through helmet decals or jersey patches, an idea that would come in collaboration with the NFL Players Association. The NFL also may produce educational programs about victims, Reed adds. The league hopes it demonstrates a genuine commitment to the public, players, and coaches, and that the player voices continue to be heard, according to Reed's source. NFL Commissioner Roger Goodell admitted in a video last month that the league was wrong for not listening to its players early and pledged alliance in the battle for social justice. Ugh. Of course, a team signing free agent quarterback Colin Kaepernick likely would be seen as more of a show of faith than anything else, the lead says or does. So again, the fact that the lead is wanting to show activism in that way is something that I think would largely align how you stand politically, if you like or disagree, with a lot of other things in politics and within social. But a lot of people are somewhat annoyed with the NFL and other sports for activism being within their sport. In other words, sports for a lot of people is something that you're able to watch and kind of turn your mind off of. Sports gives you the opportunity to sit down on your couch, sit down on your bed, whatever else, and just kind of relax and watch the team you like, or maybe a random sports team or a team you may not be fans of, but at least be able to watch and kind of turn your mind off and think about sports and not think about what you have to do next or what's on your to-do list, what are your honeydews, what is your next job assignment, what is this, what is that, what is this, what is that, what is that, the list goes on and on and on. And that's something that sports are given to do. And I know my grandpa was one of these people that got annoyed when players started to kneel during the national anthem because he viewed it as an outright disrespect to soldiers and other people who have served the country. He's all for activism as a whole and for all that, but he doesn't think that activism should be in sports. So he decided he wasn't going to watch any NFL game from now on. And he hasn't watched NFL from now on. And he was a huge Cowboys fan. So the fact that he's even done it brings a personal example to someone that has a perspective like that. Now, some people think that these athletes are brave in using their platform for activism. But the fact that the NFL as a whole organization wants to do things like these, I just think comes across as a little bit cheesy to most people. And they're trying to appeal activists, but not really trying to appeal the main people who watch their sport. And the main people who watch their sport are not racist and not people who are looking to... are not racist and looking to do that, but are people who are mainly wanting to turn off their minds and just watch sports for what sports is and not see this activism on their platform. You can use your platform outside of the game itself, but not during the game, because that is a time for everybody to kind of relax. I think a lot of people kind of view their sports and how they watch it in that perspective. And Ron says, the only thing that BLM will accomplish with their protests is to make sure that the police there is not corrected. Police abuse is not limited to one race. This is planned failure. Then Ron says that the anthem, the flag worshiping are all from being brainwashed in public school system. Lancers did not fight for a flag. They fought for liberty. Worship of any state is ideology. So I am not offended by any of those stunts. Just disappointed that anyone would think that this is correct approach to stop police abuse. Yeah, that's a big thing. I think that some people do agree with you, Ron, there, but I do think that the thing you said about brainwashing is very much true, because you're taught in public school to kind of see the flag as something that is represented for what America stands for, and at the same time, you may not think yourself that that's kind of what it stands for, and don't see it as what you call it, I'm getting tired. And you not see it as the opportunity that it's there for, but you could say that the average people who watch sports are brainwashed into believing that, and I don't necessarily think you would be wrong. But this next article is something that's always been a debate within the sports community, and mainly the NFL football community, and it is with the Washington Redskins name. So the owner, Dan Snyder, if I'm remembering right, is the owner of the Redskins, and he has always been kind of a guy who's been stern for their name. It's almost every other year, or if not every year, that there's some article that gets written that gets somewhat popular about how the Redskins name needs to be changed due to its offensive name of the Redskins being related to the Indians. And I'll read from the article. As it says, U.S. football team, the Washington Redskins, announced on Friday the team will undergo a thorough review of the team's name after the key sponsor, as well as an investment firms and shareholders, reviewed calls to change the moniker many view as a slur towards Native Americans. Team owner Dan Snyder, I forget what I said now, but wrong person, who had long resisted the campaign for a name change, said in a statement that the process allows the team to take into account only the proud tradition and history of the franchise, but also input from an alumni, sponsors, the National Football League, and local community. Shipping company FedEx asked for rebranding on Thursday as Nike pulled merchandise from the Washington, D.C.-based NFL team from its website. FedEx said in a statement untamed by U.S. TV sports channel ESPN, it has committed to the team in Washington our request that the name be changed. The company paid $205 million to the Redskins for naming rights to the team's home stadium in Landover, Maryland in 1998 in a deal that runs through 2025. Frederick Smith, the chairman of FedEx CEO and president, owns a minority stake in the Redskins. Last week, FedEx, Nike, and PepsiCo all received letters from a group of 87 investment firms that held more than $620 million in assets, requesting to end the business with the Redskins. The calls were motivated by racial justice protests following the killing of George Floyd. In a letter to Nike, many of us have raised the issue with Nike for years, to Little Voy, investors wrote. But in light of the Black Lives Matter movement that has focused the world's attention on centuries of systematic racism, we are witnessing a fresh outpouring of oppression to the team's name. Therefore, it is time for Nike to meet the magnitude of this movement, to make their oppression to the racist team name clear, to take tangible and meaningful steps to expert pressure on the team to cause using it. And that's kind of a interesting thing too, because as I mentioned earlier, it's almost every year or every other year that the Redskins controversy gets brought up again for the NFL team. And it's a name of a football team, and obviously some people might see it as a slur. But one of the big motives that I think of the Redskins wanting to change their name and their owner wanting to change their name is the potential of FedEx wanting to remove their sponsor and Nike wanting to remove their sponsor. And all that money would simply just go away, and therefore they wouldn't have as much sponsors and simply money. So a lot of times in business, and in other words, you just simply follow the money, and through following the money, you can see that due to changing their name, the Redskins would stay as a company much better than if they were to keep their name and lose all that sponsors and all their money. So I think it's probably as simple as that, and they're using George Floyd and all the activism of Black Lives Matter as a movement to push for the name change as a alternative point. And make sure okay, we are good there. And I'll read Juan's here. I live in Oklahoma. This is a Native American country. We have many different tribes in my area. I don't know one person who is red-skinned. The protest of a name is nonsense. Anybody who identifies as a redskin, please send me a picture of your red skin. I have a red skin when I sunburn. Maybe they can just drop their profile of a native warrior. The Braves only have a tomahawk for their icon. It doesn't really affect me either way. I just find it to be a bunch of nonsense. And I think a lot of people agree with you. I know one of my teachers in college was a Redskins fan and lived in that area for a while when he was a kid. And he was kind of talking about how it's just a name, and the people getting offended by a name seems rather silly to him. And you could kind of approach it as the same situation as a statue, as a lot of people see a statue just as a statue, as a lot of people see a name just as a name. But I would argue that a name doesn't even have as much as a meaning as a statue does, as a statue is a physical representation rather than a name is just kind of something you can call yourself or call your business or whatever. And I do think that the idea of maybe changing the logo, as you mentioned with their baseball team, the Braves, is a rather interesting idea, and they might be able to keep their name as Redskins the same. But again, I think it's a rather silly thing from the start, and I think that the decision to change their name might have a little bit of Black Lives Matter and activism in that way in it, but at the same time, I think it could simply due to them wanting to change their name to fit their sponsors' requirements so that they keep their money. And now this brings me to the Eagles. Deshaun Jackson says he doesn't hate Jewish community after posting an anti-Semitic message. Philadelphia Eagles wide receiver Deshaun Jackson said he has no hatred towards the Jewish community and insisted 2 separate statements of apology with a promise to do better after he posted on social media Monday an anti-Semitic message that he attributed to Adolf Hitler and an admiration for the Nation of Islam leader Louis Franklin. The Eagles on Tuesday responded by calling Jackson's post offensive and harmful and absolutely appalling, and said the team would take appropriate action. Team owner Jeffrey Lurie and general manager Howie Roseman are Jewish. Jackson spoke with Lurie late Tuesday afternoon, a source told ESPN Tim McCants, with Lurie expressing deep disappointment in his player. Jackson expressed a desire to educate himself and work directly with the Jewish community, and a short time later, his camp contacted the rabbi at Shabbat, Young Villi, to discuss ways for Jackson to donate and work with the organization. The controversy spun out of Jackson's Instagram story, on which he featured a quote that he attributed to Hitler that said, "White Jews will blackmail America. They will export America. Their plan for the war domination won't work if the know who they are." And I did because I know Susan Wiki isn't necessarily going to agree with that as a statement, but at the same time, freedom of speech. So you kind of know where that stands for, and the word of that relating to it. And then he said he also shared 2 posts on Instagram on Saturday and on Monday expressing admiration for Franklin, who wrote Anti-Defamation League and Southern Poverty Law Center have identified as an anti-Semitic. These posts have since been deleted. We have spoken with wide receiver Deshaun Jackson about his social media posts, the Eagles said in a statement. Regardless of his intentions, the message he shared were offensive, harmful, and absolutely appalling. They have no place in our society and are condoned or supported in any way by the organization. We are disappointed that we are reiterated to Deshaun the importance of not only apologizing, but also using his platform to take action to promote unity, equality, and respect. We are continuing to evaluate the circumstances and will take appropriate action. We take these matters very seriously and are committed to continuing to have productive and meaningful conversations with Deshaun, as well as our players and staff, in order to educate, learn, and grow. And Ron says, just more virtue signaling. Those who act like they are offended are just trying to stir up controversy where none exists. And again, virtual signaling has become very popular. And this article with Deshaun Jackson goes on and on and on and kind of says a lot of things. It's rather in-depth. If you're a sports fan and kind of bored, you can read the whole thing. As again, it will be in my description of my podcast and my YouTube channel and others. But that's kind of all I wanted to talk about there. But another thing I wanted to hint at is, one, a lot of things that your parents might tell you, and gets a little bit repetitive within that, but essentially you have to be very careful what you post on social media, because anything you post can essentially be found and have a greater impact on your life. But especially if you're a celebrity or someone that's in a football league or in a national setting such as NFL, you want to be extra careful what you post on your account that is directly related to you. And educating yourself is kind of the second point I want to talk about. Number two, after just being simply careful, is being able to educate yourself on certain issues. Google exists now, and Google is very one-sided in what articles pop up at first and other things and all that. You know, you have all your biases, but in general, you can look up anything you want on Google, especially when it's relating to educating yourself on an issue like this, on Jewish communities and what they've gone through, and be able to figure out a full detailed perspective of the community itself. And it's very easy to educate yourself on that as well as anything else. And you can even educate yourself on how Black Lives Matter has started, gun rights, anything else. You can name anything, and chances are you can at least educate yourself somewhat on Google. And you even have peer-reviewed journals on Google Scholar and other things if you really want more detailed perspectives. So that's kind of all I wanted to talk about there. And then I wanted to talk about the great old example of Colin Kaepernick with NFL and all the things he has done. And these are my last two articles that I'm going to bring up for today's podcast. As this one says, former 49ers quarterback Colin Kaepernick stirs up controversy with July 4th Twitter post. Former San Francisco quarterback and Black Lives Matter activist Colin Kaepernick set off a social media firestorm Sunday with a Twitter post critical of the 4th of July holiday. On Twitter, Kaepernick posted, "Black people have been dehumanized, brutalized, criminalized, plus terrorized by America for centuries and are expected to join your commemoration of independence while you enslaved our ancestors. We reject your celebration of white supremacy and look forward to liberation for all." This post has generated an avalanche of comments, both supportive and critical of his comments. Kaepernick has also been a polarizing figure ever since he took a knee while the 49ers during the national anthem to take a stand against police brutality and racial injustice in 2016. At the time, he was mostly alone. Politicians, team owners, and fellow players criticized him, fans burned his jersey, and he was even booed even at home 4 years later. His protest is widely viewed as a present of the current Black Lives Matter movement. Even NFL Commissioner Roger Goodell has apologized for players for not listening to them earlier. We, the National Football League, condemn racism with the systematic oppression of black people, Goodell said in a video released Friday. We, the National Football League, admit we are wrong for not listening to NFL players earlier and encourage all to speak out and peacefully protest. We, the National Football League, believe Black Lives Matter. I personally protest with you and want to be part of the much needed change in this country. And it goes on to talk about some of the motives for why Colin Kaepernick might have sent out his tweet. And obviously, you can read his tweet and figure out that there are many things wrong with it. And essentially, the biggest thing I could say with his tweet is simply, again, with educating yourself. You can educate yourself and find out that although some of America's history was bad through the ownership of slaves, it wasn't just a white ownership of slaves. There was also black owners who also owned slaves and African Americans who owned African American slaves. It wasn't just a one-way train. And it's very important to learn and to be able to realize and all the things relating to it. Because being able to have an impact as Colin Kaepernick has had and have a social platform as Colin Kaepernick has had is very important you use it right. And I think that his tweet is very much one-sided, and I don't think makes things for the better, but rather stirs up even more of a issue between both the peaceful protesters and the protesters that want a little bit more. But Colin Kaepernick has also done something a little bit more activism as well, and that is being related to him now announcing a partnership with Disney. And this partnership is as defined on this ESPN article. Colin Kaepernick will be featured in an exclusive docuseries produced by ESPN Films as a part of a first-look deal with the Walt Disney Company. The deal between Kaepernick's production arm, Raw Vision Media, and Disney was announced Monday. The partnership will focus on telling scripted and unscripted stories that will explore race, social injustice, and the quest for equality. It will also provide a platform to showcase the work of minority directors and producers. I am excited to announce the historic partnership with Disney across all of its platforms to evaluate black and brown directors, creators, storytellers, and producers, and to inspire the youth with compelling, authentic perspectives, Kaepernick said in a statement. I look forward to sharing the docuseries on my life story, in addition to many other cultural impactful projects we are developing. Despite being expelled from the NFL since the 2016 season, when he took a knee during the national anthem to protest police brutality and racial inequality, Kaepernick still wants to play. A person close to the former San Francisco 49ers quarterback told the Associated Press that Kaepernick is in excellent shape and ready to play, but he hasn't received any calls. Following the nationwide protest and aftermath of George Floyd's death, NFL Commissioner Roger Goodell apologized to players for not listening to their concerns. Kaepernick, who became the face of the Nike campaign in 2018, will work closely with the Undefeated, which is expanding its portfolio across Disney to develop stories from the perspective of black and brown communities. His deal with the Walt Disney Company will extend across all Disney platforms, including Walt Disney Television, ESPN, Hulu, Pixar, and The Undefeated. During this unprecedented time, the Walt Disney Company remains committed to creating diverse, inclusive content that retrospects and matters, said Bob Iger, Disney Executive Chairman. Colin's experience gives him unique perspective on the intersection of sports, culture, and race, which will undoubtedly create compelling stories that will educate, enlighten, and entertain, and we look forward to working with him on this important collaboration. The docuseries chronicling Kaepernick's journey in his last 5 years is the first project in development. The series will include new interviews, and other never-seen-before elements as part of the docuseries. Jamal Hill, who previously worked for ESPN and Undefeated, is a producer on the project. Developing exponential storytelling told through a wide array of voices is the core of who we are at ESPN. ESPN President Jimmy Patrio said, Colin has had a similar path as both an athlete and an activist. And as the nation continues to confront racism and social injustice, it feels practically relevant to hear Colin's voice on his evolution and motivations. So that was what Colin Kaepernick is teaming up with Disney. And obviously we don't know what it's all going to be about, but I would be very careful to not make it fully a propaganda type of media expansion for Kaepernick. Because if the documentary is well done and shares interviews and isn't just completely one-sided and more of a factual based, I do think that it could be a rather good version of Colin Kaepernick and what he wants to do. But at the same time, I don't know if Kaepernick is being truly honest with everyone. Because at one point, Colin Kaepernick had a workout opportunity with many of the managers and scouts. And many scouts of major teams were willing to watch Kaepernick in his workout that he organized with some other players. And at the last minute, Kaepernick changed the venues of where this was being done. And at that point, some scouts decided not to show up because they were a little bit aggravated, but some scouts still did show up at Kaepernick's workout. But the workout wasn't necessarily what the scouts wanted to see. It was more an activist, as Kaepernick had a shirt of someone of being a political activist as well. and many other things, and didn't really seem to take the workout as seriously as the scouts wanted to see. Therefore, he didn't get hired by any other team. So I'm not sure if Kaepernick is being 100% honest if he's wanting to fully play as an NFL quarterback, but rather trying to make people believe he might want to boost up his status on Twitter and other things of being simply an activist. Because I think at this point, Kaepernick's main goal is to be an activist for the Black Lives Matter movement and share what he wants to view of the black community out to everybody through his perspective and through activism in his way. So that's all of the articles I wanted to talk about here, and I hope you liked what you had to hear on my first podcast with everybody, and I hope everybody enjoyed the Breakdown with Berckenhoff, and I'll have my next podcast episode out next week as well. And as I said at the beginning, all these podcasts are live streamed on my Twitch, which is Roundtable Talk, my D Live, and YouTube at Roundtable Decision. I appreciate you, Ron and Ludwig and Ed, for stopping by on my comments and sharing what you have to believe with the issues I talked about today. It greatly helps, and I really appreciate it. But before I end all, I quickly wanted to mention Freedom Scoop again. If you like the content you had to hear on this podcast today, and you want to hear someone else and maybe listen to them as well, I would highly suggest you going to freedomscoop.com, where you can listen to Ed, you can listen to Generational Gap, Steven, and they all have shows what kind of are similar to this one, but also a little bit different, with Steven doing a lot of interviews and being on different podcast channels as of late. So I hope you enjoyed all of the discussion here, and see you with the next one.